The moment your own child stops seeing you as a mother and starts seeing you as a burden, something inside you breaks forever. I sat alone outside St. Anthony Medical Center, with a plastic hospital bag in my lap, and a folded walker beside my wheelchair, while snow drifted slowly across the parking lot. The automatic glass doors kept opening behind me every few seconds, letting warm air spill onto the sidewalk before snapping shut again, and each time they opened, I looked up hoping to see my daughter Emily rushing toward me with that worried look she used to have when she was little and thought I could never survive without her. But she never came. My discharge papers had been signed almost 2 hours earlier. Nurses passed by me with sympathetic smiles. One of them even asked softly, "Are you sure someone's coming?" And I forced myself to smile back, because I was too embarrassed to tell her the truth. Emily had promised she would be there. She promised me 3 times before my surgery. "Mom, don't worry about a thing," she had said while standing beside my hospital bed the night before the operation. "I'll take care of you." Those words kept replaying in my head while I stared at my phone screen for the 20th time. No missed calls. No texts. Nothing except a Facebook notification showing Emily smiling in a photo with her friends at some winery outside Boulder. Wine glasses raised. Perfect makeup. Perfect smile. While I sat in a hospital wheelchair unable to even bend down far enough to tie my own shoes. I wish I could tell you that was the moment I stopped loving my daughter, but mothers don't work that way. Even when our hearts crack open, part of us still keeps making excuses for the people hurting us. Maybe traffic was bad. Maybe one of the kids got sick. Maybe she forgot her phone charger. I kept inventing reasons for her because the real explanation hurt too much. Finally, a young nurse named Carla crouched beside me and touched my shoulder gently. "Honey, it's getting cold out here. Let me call you a cab." I nodded because my throat felt too tight to speak. The taxi driver helped load my walker into the trunk while I struggled to lower myself into the back seat without crying out from the pain in my hip. Every bump in the road sent a sharp ache through my body during the 40-minute ride home to my little ranch house outside Denver. The driver kept glancing at me through the mirror like he wanted to say something comforting, but didn't know how. Honestly, neither did I. When I finally got inside my house, silence greeted me like an old enemy. No soup on the stove. No groceries in the refrigerator except expired yogurt and half a carton of milk. No daughter waiting to help me settle into bed after major surgery. Just silence and the faint smell of dust in a home that suddenly felt much too large for one aging woman. I carefully lowered myself onto the couch and reached for my pain medication with trembling hands. That was when my phone finally buzzed. My heart jumped so fast it actually hurt. But the message from Emily only said, "Sorry, Mom. Crazy busy today. I'll check on you later this week." I stared at those words for a very long time. Later this week. As if recovering from surgery was some minor inconvenience that could wait between brunch plans and yoga classes. And then, less than a minute later, another text appeared. "By the way, have you thought any more about what you're doing with Dad's retirement account?" I remember blinking at the screen because for one strange second, I honestly thought I had read it wrong. Not "How are you feeling?" Not "Do you need groceries?" Not "Are you okay?" Just money. Always money. And sitting there alone in my quiet living room, with snow falling outside my window and pain radiating through my body, I realized something that terrified me more than the surgery ever had. My daughter wasn't worried about losing me. She was worried about losing what I had. The first week after surgery taught me something nobody warns you about when you get older. Pain is manageable. Loneliness is not. Every movement inside my little house became a careful calculation. It took me nearly 15 minutes just to get out of bed each morning because my hip felt stiff and heavy, and the doctor had warned me not to twist too quickly or risk another injury. I kept a wooden cane beside the nightstand, along with a bottle of water, my reading glasses, and the small orange pill container holding my medication schedule. The mornings were the hardest because that was when I still expected Emily to suddenly remember she had a mother recovering alone. Every time headlights passed my front window, I looked up. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart lifted for half a second before reality settled back in again. Most days it was only spam calls or pharmacy reminders. Emily did call twice that week, but both conversations lasted less than 3 minutes. "How are you feeling?" she asked quickly during the first call, while I could hear dishes clattering in the background, and one of her children shouting about soccer practice. Before I could even answer honestly, she sighed and said, "Listen, Mom, I am swamped right now. I barely have time to breathe." Then, almost casually, she added, "Did you ever decide what you are doing with Dad's retirement money?" I remember staring at the family photos on my mantel while she talked. There was one picture from 20 years ago at Yellowstone National Park. Emily was smiling with braces and freckles, sitting on her father's shoulders while I held her hand near Old Faithful. Back then she used to call me 3 times a day from college because she missed home cooking and wanted advice about laundry and boys and life. Somewhere along the line, those calls changed. Slowly, almost invisibly. The older I got, the more our conversations became about what I owned instead of who I was. By Thursday, my refrigerator was nearly empty. I finally worked up the courage to ask Emily if she could stop by the grocery store for me. There was a long pause on the phone before she answered. "Mom, grocery delivery exists now. You know that, right?" Her tone was not cruel exactly. That was what made it sting worse. It sounded impatient. Dismissive. Like I was an inconvenience she wished would modernize herself already. I quietly told her I had never used those apps before. She let out a tired laugh and said, "I will help you figure it out later, okay?" Later never came. That night I ate crackers and canned soup while sitting alone in my recliner, with a heating blanket over my legs. Around 9 o'clock, I opened Facebook again even though I knew I should not. Emily had posted another photo. This time she and her husband Brian were at a steakhouse downtown holding oversized cocktails and smiling at the camera like people without a single worry in the world. Hundreds of dollars spent on dinner and drinks while I was counting pain pills and trying not to slip in my own shower. The next morning, I attempted to carry a laundry basket from the hallway to the washing machine and nearly lost my balance. The basket tipped over, towels scattering across the floor while a sharp pain shot through my hip hard enough to make me gasp. I stood there gripping the wall, breathing carefully until the ache settled. And in that moment, something inside me shifted. Not anger. Not yet. Just clarity. I realized if I fell in this house, nobody would know for hours. Maybe days. Emily lived less than 30 minutes away, but emotionally she might as well have been across the country. Around noon, someone knocked gently at my front door. I expected another package delivery, or maybe a neighborhood kid selling fundraiser chocolates. Instead, I found my neighbor Carol standing there holding a casserole dish covered with foil. Carol was about my age, maybe 70, with silver hair tucked beneath a knitted winter hat and kind blue eyes that always looked genuinely interested when she spoke to people. "I saw your car has not moved in days," she said softly. "I figured you could probably use a decent meal." I almost cried right there on the front porch, because that simple act of kindness felt more comforting than anything my own daughter had done since my surgery. Carol stepped inside and placed the casserole on my kitchen counter while the smell of chicken and rosemary filled the room. "You should not be alone recovering like this," she murmured. And for the first time all week, someone finally said exactly what my heart had been trying not to admit. Over the next 2 weeks, Carol became the person who noticed whether I had eaten, whether I needed help carrying groceries, whether my face looked pale from pain or exhaustion. Emily became the person who only called when she wanted information. The difference between those two things settled heavily on my heart every single day. Carol started stopping by every afternoon around 3 o'clock, after her volunteer shift at the church pantry downtown. Sometimes she brought homemade soup or banana bread. Other times she simply sat with me at the kitchen table while I struggled through physical therapy exercises the doctor had given me. She never made me feel weak for needing help. "Healing takes time at our age," she would say gently while handing me a cup of tea. "Do not rush yourself." Meanwhile, Emily somehow always sounded annoyed whenever I mentioned recovery. One afternoon she called while I was icing my hip in the living room. "Hey Mom," she said distractedly. "Quick question. Do you still have Dad's investment paperwork somewhere in the house?" I blinked slowly. "Hello to you too, sweetheart." There was a short silence before she gave a small laugh that sounded forced. "Sorry. How are you feeling?" The words came out automatically, like checking a box on a form. "Still healing," I answered quietly. "The physical therapist says it may take another couple of months before I am moving normally again." "Wow," she sighed. "That long?" I heard a car door slam in the background, and then Brian's voice asking her something. "Listen," she continued quickly, "Brian and I are meeting with a financial advisor next week, and we were just wondering what kind of plans you have for the future. You know, in case anything happens." In case anything happens. Such careful wording. As if she was discussing weather insurance instead of her mother's life savings. I looked around my quiet living room while she talked. The Afghan blanket folded neatly over the couch. Harold's old reading chair by the window that nobody had sat in since his heart attack 6 years earlier. The wedding photo above the fireplace, where we looked so young and certain life would always stay simple. I suddenly realized Emily was not asking these questions because she worried about my future. She was trying to calculate her own. "I have not made any decisions," I said finally. Her voice sharpened slightly. "Well, you should probably think about it. These things can get messy later." After we hung up, I sat there for a long time staring at my phone. Then I did something I had never done before in my entire life. I opened my banking app and carefully reviewed every account I shared information about with Emily over the years. Retirement funds, savings accounts, insurance policies, the deed to the house. I remembered every moment that trust had been built between us. Every time I co-signed something for her after her divorce. Every tuition payment Harold and I made for graduate school. Every Christmas, where we quietly covered expenses she and Brian could not manage that year. Parents spend decades pouring themselves into their children without keeping score. But eventually, there comes a painful moment when you realize your child has been keeping score all along. That Sunday, Emily invited me to dinner at her house for the first time since my surgery. Part of me felt hopeful driving there with my cane resting beside me in the passenger seat. Maybe she finally realized she had been distant. Maybe this was her way of reconnecting. The house smelled like garlic bread and roasted chicken when I arrived. My grandsons barely looked up from their tablets when I walked in. Brian gave me a quick side hug before returning to the football game playing in the living room. Emily rushed around setting the table while complaining about work deadlines and school schedules. Nobody asked how physical therapy was going. Nobody asked if I was sleeping through the pain yet. Halfway through dinner, Emily poured herself another glass of wine and suddenly smiled at me across the table. "Mom," she said brightly, "Brian and I have been thinking maybe you should sell your house eventually." I froze slightly with my fork halfway to my mouth. "Sell my house?" "Well, sure," she continued casually. It is way too much for one person now. Plus the market is incredible right now. You could probably get close to 700,000 for it. Brian nodded while chewing his food. Honestly, maintenance alone has to be a nightmare at your age. At your age. Those 3 words landed harder than they probably intended. Emily leaned forward. And if you downsized into a condo or senior community, you could free up a lot of money. There it was again. Money. Always wrapped inside concern. Always disguised as advice. And as I sat there listening to my daughter discuss my future like a business transaction, I suddenly understood something terrifying. Emily was already planning her life around what would happen after I was gone. The following Thursday was my grandson Tyler's 13th birthday dinner, and despite everything that had happened over the past month, I still spent almost an hour deciding what sweater to wear. That is the strange thing about mothers and grandmothers. We keep showing up with love long after love stops being returned the same way. I wrapped Tyler's gift carefully in silver paper and drove slowly across town just before sunset, gripping the steering wheel tightly whenever my hip started aching. Denver traffic crawled beneath gray winter skies, while old Christmas lights still blinked across neighborhood porches even though January was nearly over. By the time I arrived at Emily's house, my lower back throbbed from sitting too long, but I forced a smile before ringing the bell. The house was already full of noise and warm smells and laughter. Teenagers crowded around the kitchen island eating pizza, while football played loudly in the family room. Emily rushed past me carrying a tray of drinks, without even noticing I was struggling to remove my coat. "Mom, you made it," she called distractedly over her shoulder. "Can you close the door? Heat is escaping." I quietly shut the door myself while balancing against my cane. Carol's words from earlier that week echoed in my mind. The people who truly care about you notice when you are hurting before you have to say a word. Emily used to notice everything about me. She could tell when I had a headache just by looking at my eyes. Now she barely looked at me at all. During dinner, everyone talked over one another while I sat near the end of the table sipping water, and trying not to shift too much in my chair, because the hard wooden seat aggravated my hip. Brian discussed mortgage rates with his brother. The boys argued about basketball. Emily kept checking her phone between bites of salad. I mostly listened quietly, smiling whenever someone glanced my way. At one point Tyler thanked me politely for the new gaming headset I bought him, and for a moment my heart softened seeing how genuinely happy he looked. Then the conversation changed. Brian's brother mentioned how expensive home repairs had become lately, and Emily suddenly laughed while cutting into her chicken. "Tell me about it," she said. "Mom's house is practically falling apart, but she refuses to do anything about it." A few people chuckled lightly around the table. I felt heat creep slowly into my face. "The house is fine," I said softly. Emily waved her hand dismissively. "Mom, come on. You can barely handle stairs right now. Honestly, I do not know why you are still trying to live independently." The room grew quieter. Brian took a sip of wine without looking at me. Emily continued speaking in that bright joking tone people use when they want to sound harmless. She acts helpless whenever it is convenient, but then refuses actual advice. More laughter. Small uncomfortable laughter this time. My chest tightened so suddenly I could barely swallow. I looked down at my plate, because I did not want anyone seeing the hurt on my face. Helpless. That word settled inside me like a stone. I had worked 38 years as a school secretary. I raised Emily while helping Harold build our life from nothing after his construction business nearly failed in the 1980s. I took care of my husband through chemo appointments before losing him anyway. I survived grief, debt, surgeries, and years of sacrificing my own dreams so my daughter could chase hers. And now I was being discussed like an aging inconvenience at the corner of her dining table. Emily leaned back in her chair and laughed again. Honestly, if Mom would just move into one of those cute senior condos, everybody's life would be easier. Everybody's life. Not her mother's happiness. Not my memories inside that house. Not the garden Harold planted for our 20th anniversary, or the pencil marks still hidden inside the laundry room doorway measuring Emily's childhood height year after year. Easier. As if my existence had become a problem waiting to be solved. I noticed Tyler staring down awkwardly at his plate while the adults avoided eye contact with me. Nobody defended me. Nobody told Emily she had crossed a line. The humiliation sat there in the middle of the table like an extra guest nobody wanted to acknowledge. After dessert, I quietly gathered my purse and coat while everyone else moved into the living room for cake. Emily finally noticed me near the front door. "You are leaving already?" she asked. I nodded carefully. "I am tired." She sighed like my exhaustion inconvenienced her too. "Okay, but drive safe. Roads are icy tonight." That was it. No hug. No apology. No concern about me driving alone after dark while still recovering from surgery. Just another polite dismissal wrapped inside casual indifference. As I stepped outside into the freezing Colorado air, I realized something painful but undeniable. My daughter was no longer embarrassed by neglecting me. She had become comfortable doing it in front of other people. After Tyler's birthday dinner, something inside me became quieter. Not healed. Not stronger. Just quieter. The kind of quiet that settles over a person when they finally stop expecting kindness from someone they love. I still answered Emily's calls when she made them, but I noticed I no longer waited beside my phone hoping for them. I no longer checked Facebook searching for signs that maybe she missed me too. Instead, my days slowly began revolving around smaller things. Morning coffee by the kitchen window. Physical therapy stretches in the living room. The soft ticking of Harold's old clock above the fireplace. And Carol. Especially Carol. She started coming over almost every day now, usually carrying something homemade wrapped in foil or tucked inside reusable grocery bags. One snowy afternoon she arrived with tomato soup and grilled cheese sandwiches, because she remembered me mentioning they were Harold's favorite during winter storms. "A good meal can fix more than people realize," she said while setting bowls on the kitchen table. We ate slowly, while snow drifted past the windows in thick white sheets. For the first time in weeks, my house did not feel lonely. Carol told stories about her late husband Frank and the years they spent traveling through Arizona in an old camper after retirement. I found myself laughing at little things again. Real laughter. Not the polite, kind people force during uncomfortable family dinners. At one point she glanced at me carefully over her coffee cup. "Can I ask you something personal?" I nodded. "Why are you trying so hard not to be disappointed in your daughter?" The question caught me off guard, because it sliced directly through every excuse I had been clinging to. I stared down at my soup for several seconds before answering. Because if I admit how badly she has changed, then I also have to admit I raised someone capable of treating me this way. Carol reached across the table and squeezed my hand gently. "No, Margaret. Adults make their own choices. Good mothers blame themselves for everything. That does not mean everything is your fault." Her words stayed with me long after she left that evening. That night, I wandered slowly through my house before bed, touching familiar objects as memories followed behind me like ghosts. The framed kindergarten drawing Emily once made me with crooked crayons and glitter glue. The piano she begged us for at age 11 before quitting lessons 6 months later. The faded growth chart inside the laundry room doorway, where Harold and I measured her height every birthday, until she left for college. Every corner of that house held proof that she had once been deeply loved. So how had we ended up here? 2 days later, Emily finally came over unexpectedly. I was folding towels in the living room when her SUV pulled into the driveway. She entered carrying expensive coffee drinks and wearing designer sunglasses pushed into her blonde hair even though the sky outside was gray. "Hey Mom," she said brightly. "Thought I would check in." The sudden cheerfulness immediately made me suspicious. Emily rarely visited without a reason anymore. She handed me a caramel latte before walking through the house slowly, glancing around almost thoughtfully. "You really should update this place," she murmured while examining the kitchen counters. "Everything feels kind of outdated." I leaned carefully against the arm of the couch. "It is an older home." "Exactly," she replied quickly. "That is why selling now would make so much sense." There it was again. Always circling back to the same subject. She sat beside me and crossed her legs elegantly. "Brian found this beautiful active, adult community near Littleton. They have fitness classes, security gates, housekeeping services. Honestly, you would probably be happier there." "Probably?" I asked quietly. She smiled tightly. "Mom, I am just trying to help you think ahead." Then she lowered her voice slightly. "And between us, the market is so strong right now that you could make enough from the sale to really help the boys later. College is going to be expensive. Help the boys. Not help me recover. Not help me feel safe. Not help me rebuild my strength after surgery." Every conversation somehow led back to what my money could do for everyone else. Emily stood and wandered toward the hallway while speaking casually over her shoulder. "You know, Brian was also wondering if you ever updated your will after Dad passed." My stomach tightened instantly. She said it too casually. Too naturally. Like she had rehearsed the question beforehand. Why would Brian wonder about my will? Emily hesitated for half a second before laughing softly. "Mom, do not make it weird. We are just trying to make sure everything is organized in case of emergencies." Emergencies? Such a harmless-sounding word. But standing there in my own living room, while my daughter examined my future like a financial project, I suddenly realized something chilling. Emily was no longer simply curious about my money. She was already counting on it. By early February, I was walking better. The cane still came with me most places, but the sharp pain in my hip had finally softened into a dull ache that only flared during cold mornings or after too many stairs. Physical therapy was helping, and for the first time since surgery, I started feeling something dangerous again. Independence. Not because of Emily. Because of myself. Because every difficult thing I had survived in life eventually taught me how strong I really was once I stopped waiting for someone else to save me. Carol noticed the change immediately. "You are standing straighter," she said one afternoon while helping me repot plants near the kitchen window. I smiled faintly. Maybe I finally got tired of feeling sorry for myself. "No," she corrected gently. "You finally stopped begging for love from the wrong people." Her words settled deeply into me because I knew she was right. The more distance I created emotionally from Emily, the more clearly I started seeing things I had ignored for years. The expensive vacations she somehow afforded while constantly complaining about bills. The subtle pressure whenever inheritance or property came up in conversation. The way Brian always suddenly became attentive anytime finances were discussed. Little pieces began fitting together into a picture I no longer wanted to deny. Then one Saturday afternoon, everything changed completely. Emily had invited me over again, this time for one of Tyler's basketball games followed by lunch at their house. I almost declined, but part of me still clung to the hope that maybe things could improve if I just kept trying hard enough. The gym smelled like popcorn and polished wood floors while parents shouted encouragement from the bleachers. Tyler played well, and seeing him smile after scoring a basket warmed my heart enough to temporarily quiet all the heaviness between Emily and me. After the game, we returned to the house while the boys disappeared upstairs to play video games. Emily left briefly to pick up dessert from a bakery nearby, and Brian took a work call in the backyard. I was alone in the kitchen rinsing coffee mugs, when I heard voices drifting through the slightly open sliding glass door. At first I was not trying to eavesdrop. But then I heard my own name. Brian's voice was low and irritated. "You need to push harder about the house." Emily sighed heavily. "I know, but if I pressure her too much, she gets emotional." Brian let out a short laugh. "Emily, come on. That property alone has to be worth at least 700 grand. Now? Plus the retirement accounts. Once everything transfers, we can finally move out of this neighborhood." My hands froze around the coffee mug. The world suddenly felt strangely distant, like I was underwater listening through glass. Emily lowered her voice further, but I could still hear every word clearly enough. "I just wish she would make things easier instead of acting so attached to that old house." Brian replied instantly. "She's old, Em. Realistically, how much longer is she even going to manage on her own?" Silence followed for a few seconds before Emily spoke again, quieter this time. "I just do not want money tied up in probate forever if something happens unexpectedly." Something happens unexpectedly. Not if I recovered fully. Not if I lived another 20 years. Not if I found happiness again after losing Harold. Just calculations. Timelines. Logistics surrounding my eventual death. My knees felt weak, so I lowered myself carefully into a kitchen chair while their voices continued outside. "Honestly," Brian muttered, "once the house is ours, we could finally renovate, or even sell it and move somewhere bigger. Ours. Not hers someday if she chooses. Ours." As though my life had already become an inheritance waiting to be processed. In that moment, a painful truth finally settled fully into place inside my heart. Emily was not worried about me being alone after surgery, because my suffering did not affect her future. What mattered to her was securing whatever came after me. I sat there staring at Harold's old wedding ring on my finger while memories flooded through me all at once. The second job Harold worked so Emily could attend private school. The years we skipped vacations to build savings for her future. The nights I stayed awake beside her bed when she had pneumonia as a child. Everything we gave her had come from love. Real love. And somehow that love had transformed into entitlement. A few minutes later, Emily returned carrying a white bakery box and smiling brightly as she walked through the kitchen door. "Mom, they had your favorite lemon cake," she said cheerfully before stopping short when she saw my face. "Are you okay?" I looked at her carefully for a long moment. The same blue eyes I used to kiss goodnight when she was little stared back at me with concern that suddenly felt rehearsed. And for the very first time in my life, I realized something heartbreaking. I no longer trusted my own daughter. For several days after overhearing Emily and Brian in the backyard, I moved through life like someone waking up from a long illusion. Everything looked the same on the surface. The same quiet house. The same winter sunlight stretching across the kitchen floor each morning. The same phone calls from Emily asking casual questions about my health before somehow steering every conversation back toward finances. But now I heard the hidden meaning underneath every word. It was like finally noticing a crack in a wall you could never unsee afterward. One morning, Emily called while I was watering the plants Harold used to care for. "Hey Mom," she said brightly. "How are you feeling today?" "Better," I answered carefully. "Physical therapy is helping." "That is great," she replied quickly. Oh, by the way, Brian was asking whether you ever added my name to the house paperwork after Dad passed. I closed my eyes slowly. There it was again. Not concern. Not love. Strategy. No, I said calmly. A small pause followed. Well, Emily continued with forced lightness, you really should think about making things easier legally while you still can. While you still can. I nearly laughed at how transparent the sentence sounded now. After we hung up, I sat quietly in Harold's old reading chair for nearly an hour, staring at the snow melting slowly off the backyard fence. My marriage to Harold lasted 42 years. We were not wealthy people, but we built stability carefully over decades. Every dollar in our retirement account came from skipped luxuries and hard work. Harold used to joke that our savings account was 40 years of saying no to stupid purchases. And somehow our daughter had started viewing that lifetime of sacrifice as her future reward. That afternoon, Carol came by carrying tulips in a mason jar because she said the house needed a little spring. I finally told her everything I overheard in the backyard. Every word. Every cold calculation. Carol listened quietly without interrupting while I spoke. When I finished, she looked at me with sad understanding instead of shock. You know what hurts the most? I whispered. Part of me still wants to defend her. Carol nodded gently. Because you are her mother. Tears burned suddenly behind my eyes. I keep thinking maybe I failed somehow. Maybe I spoiled her too much after Harold died. Maybe I made money too easy for her. Carol sat beside me on the couch and shook her head slowly. Margaret, there is a difference between raising a child with love and raising one without gratitude. One was your responsibility. The other was hers. That night I barely slept. I kept replaying memories over and over in my mind like old home movies. Emily at 7 years old baking Christmas cookies beside me in reindeer pajamas. Emily crying after her first heartbreak in college while I stayed awake all night comforting her. Emily standing at my hospital bed before surgery promising she would take care of me. Somewhere between those memories and the woman she had become now, something essential had disappeared. By the following Tuesday, I made a decision that terrified me more than surgery ever had. I called an attorney. His name was Daniel Mercer, and he specialized in estate planning for retirees. Carol recommended him after helping another widow from church update her trust the previous year. My hands trembled slightly while dialing the number because part of me still felt guilty for even considering it. Like protecting myself from my own daughter somehow made me disloyal as a mother. But another part of me finally understood something important. Love without boundaries eventually becomes permission for people to use you. Daniel's office sat inside a quiet brick building near downtown Denver, with leather chairs and soft instrumental music playing in the waiting room. He looked to be in his late 50s with silver hair and calm eyes that reminded me slightly of Harold. After listening carefully to my situation, he folded his hands together on the desk. Mrs. Whitmore, he said gently, you are not obligated to leave assets to anyone who treats you poorly. Hearing someone say those words out loud nearly broke my heart all over again. Because until that moment, I had not realized how deeply trapped I felt by motherhood itself. As though giving birth to Emily meant surrendering the right to protect myself from her behavior forever. Daniel explained my options carefully. Updating the will. Creating a living trust. Assigning medical power of attorney to someone reliable instead of family automatically. The conversation felt surreal. Not because of the paperwork. Because I suddenly realized I trusted my neighbor Carol more than my own daughter. Before leaving, Daniel asked one final question quietly. If you became seriously ill tomorrow, who would genuinely take care of you out of love instead of obligation? I answered without hesitation this time. Not my daughter. And the moment those words left my mouth, I knew there was no going back. After meeting with Daniel Mercer, I stopped reacting emotionally whenever Emily brought up money. That surprised even me. For months, every comment from her had felt like another small cut across my heart. But now something had changed. Once you finally accept that someone sees you as useful instead of loved, their behavior stops confusing you. It still hurts. But it no longer shocks you. Daniel helped me create a new living trust that week. We updated every document carefully inside his quiet office while soft jazz played from a speaker near the bookshelf. I transferred control of my medical decisions away from Emily completely. I updated beneficiaries on several accounts. Most importantly, I established clear instructions regarding the house Harold and I spent our lives paying for. Daniel reviewed everything twice before sliding the final paperwork toward me. "You are protecting yourself," he reminded me gently after noticing my hesitation. "That is not cruelty." I signed my name slowly anyway, because part of me still grieved the daughter I thought I had. A few days later, Emily invited me to Sunday dinner again. Her sudden increase in invitations almost made me laugh now that I understood the reason behind them. Before surgery, she barely had time to answer a text. Now she suddenly wanted family dinners, check-ins, and long conversations about planning ahead. The timing was impossible to ignore. Snow was finally beginning to melt around Denver, leaving wet sidewalks and pale patches of grass across the neighborhood. I arrived carrying a small pie from the bakery near my house, while Emily greeted me at the door with unusual warmth. "Mom, you look so much better," she said brightly, hugging me quickly. "See? I told you recovery would get easier." I almost asked when exactly she had helped make it easier, but instead I simply smiled politely and walked inside. During dinner, Emily acted sweeter than she had in months. She refilled my water before I asked. She asked about physical therapy. She even complimented my sweater. Brian joined in too, nodding sympathetically whenever I mentioned lingering pain from surgery. The performance would have fooled me completely a year ago. Now I noticed every rehearsed detail. Halfway through dessert, Emily finally arrived at the real reason for the invitation. "Mom," she began carefully while setting down her wine glass, "Brian and I have been thinking a lot about the future lately." I remained quiet. "We just worry about you being alone," she continued softly. "Especially after the surgery scare." Surgery scare. Such an interesting phrase for the weeks she left me struggling alone. Brian leaned forward supportively. "We were actually wondering if maybe it would make sense for us to help manage some things now before they become overwhelming." There it was. I folded my napkin carefully in my lap. "Manage what exactly?" Emily exchanged a quick glance with Brian before answering. "Well, finances. Property stuff. Legal paperwork. We just think it would be smart if our names were added to certain accounts eventually. You know, just in case." Just in case. Everyone suddenly loved those words. I looked around the dining room slowly. Family photos lined the walls. Tyler laughing at Disneyland. School portraits. Christmas mornings. Years of memories displayed like proof that we were still a close family. But beneath all of it sat greed so obvious now I could practically taste it. In the room. "That sounds unnecessary," I said calmly. Emily's smile tightened almost invisibly. "Mom, do not make this harder than it needs to be." Harder for whom? I wondered silently. Brian cleared his throat. "Nobody is trying to pressure you. We are just thinking practically." Practical. Another harmless-sounding word people use when discussing someone else's money. Emily reached across the table and touched my hand with sudden tenderness. "We only want to help you." I stared down at her manicured fingers resting against mine, and remembered sitting alone outside the hospital, after surgery, while snow fell across the parking lot, and my daughter never came. Help! The word almost felt insulting now. Slowly, I pulled my hand back. I already handled my legal paperwork, I said quietly. The room changed instantly. Emily blinked. What do you mean? I met with an attorney. Brian's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. Emily tried to smile again, but I saw panic flicker behind her eyes for the first time. Without telling us, she asked carefully. I nodded once. There was nothing to discuss. Silence spread heavily across the table. Tyler and his younger brother glanced between us awkwardly before returning to their phones. Emily finally spoke again, her voice thinner now. So what exactly did you change? I looked directly at my daughter, and for the first time in months, I did not feel weak sitting across from her. Everything that needed changing, I answered calmly. Emily's face lost color immediately. And in that moment, I realized something almost tragic. The strongest emotional reaction she had shown toward me in years only appeared after she realized she might not get what she wanted from me anymore. After that dinner, Emily called me 4 times in 3 days. Before, weeks could pass without hearing from her unless she needed something. Suddenly she wanted updates about my health, invitations for coffee, little conversations about family memories. The shift would have touched me once. Now it only confirmed everything I already knew. The first call came the very next morning while I was pruning dead branches from the rose bushes Harold planted years ago. Beside the front porch. Mom, Emily said carefully, I have been thinking a lot about our conversation. I continued clipping quietly. Which part? She hesitated. The lawyer part. There it was again. Straight to the real concern. I just do not understand why you would make big decisions without talking to me first. I looked out across the neighborhood while cold spring sunlight stretched across the street. Because the last time I truly needed you, you were too busy to come pick me up from the hospital. Silence filled the line immediately. Emily exhaled sharply. Mom, are we seriously still talking about that? The words hit me harder than yelling ever could have. Still talking about that? As if being abandoned after surgery was some tiny misunderstanding I should have gotten over by now. Yes, I answered calmly. We are. Emily's voice tightened with frustration. I said I was overwhelmed. You know how crazy life has been lately. Your life was not too crazy to go wine tasting, I replied quietly before I could stop myself. Another silence followed. Longer this time. So you have been stalking my Facebook now, she snapped. I closed my eyes slowly. There it was. Not guilt. Not regret. Defensiveness. The conversation ended badly after that, with Emily insisting I was twisting everything, and me quietly telling her I needed space. But strangely, after hanging up, I did not cry. For months I cried after almost every interaction with my daughter. This time I simply felt tired. Tired in the deep emotional way that comes after loving someone harder than they love you back for too long. A week later, Daniel Mercer invited me to his office one final time to review all completed paperwork. The trust was finalized. The house would eventually be sold, with a portion funding educational accounts directly for my grandsons when they became adults. The remainder would go towards several local charities Harold cared deeply about, including the Veterans Housing nonprofit, where he volunteered after retirement. Emily would receive a modest personal inheritance, but nothing close to the financial future she and Brian clearly expected. Are you comfortable with these decisions? Daniel asked gently before I signed the final page. I thought about the woman sitting alone outside the hospital in a wheelchair, while snow fell around her because her daughter could not make time to come. Then I thought about Carol carrying soup to my house simply because she noticed my car had not moved for days. Yes, I answered firmly. I finally am. By April, my recovery was nearly complete. I started walking through the neighborhood every morning again, slowly rebuilding strength beneath bright Colorado skies, while early spring flowers pushed through the thawing ground. Carol often joined me, and together we laughed about small things like terrible television shows and overpriced grocery stores, and how strange it felt growing older in a world that moved too fast. One afternoon after our walk, I sat alone on my back patio watching the sunset turn the mountains pale gold in the distance when Emily unexpectedly arrived. She stepped out of her SUV looking nervous in a way I had never seen before. "Can we talk?" she asked softly. I nodded toward the patio chair across from me. For several moments she just sat there twisting her wedding ring around her finger. Finally she looked up. "Brian thinks you are punishing us." I almost smiled at the honesty of that statement. "Not punishing her. Us? This is not punishment," I said quietly. "This is consequence." Emily's eyes filled slightly with tears. "After everything I have done for you." The words hung between us painfully. I stared at her for a long moment before answering. "Emily, you left me alone after surgery. You never asked if I was scared. You never asked if I had food. You only asked about money." Her face crumpled defensively. "That is not fair." "No," I replied softly. What was not fair was realizing my neighbor cared more about me than my own daughter did. Tears slipped down her cheeks then, but even in that moment, I could not tell whether she mourned losing me or losing access to the future she imagined inheriting. Maybe she did not know either. After she left, I sat outside until the sun disappeared completely and the evening air turned cool against my skin. And for the first time in a very long while, I felt peaceful. Not because my family was fixed. It was not. Not because the betrayal hurt any less. It still did. But because I finally understood something women like me spend too many years forgetting. Love does not require you to surrender your dignity. And the people who abandon you in your weakest moments do not deserve control over the life you fought so hard to build.